right, so welcome again to NFLT's Working Lunch Wednesday. It is my pleasure to now introduce our speaker for today, Dr. Scott F. Jones. Dr. Jones is an assistant professor of biology at the University of North Florida. He received his PhD in environmental and evolutionary biology from the University of Louisiana at Lafayette and conducted postdoctoral research as a biologist with the U.S. Geological Survey in Davis, California. Dr. Jones has worked to understand coastal wetlands on the West, Gulf, and East Coasts for more than a decade, and his lab group at UNF called WeEco explores coastal and wetland ecosystems with a particular focus on resilience to global change. So with that, thank you so much, Dr. Jones, for joining us today, and I'm going to turn it over to you to share with us.
Awesome. Thank you, Abby, for that introduction. And really happy to be with you all today to talk a little bit about coastal wetlands, their resilience with a specific view to Northeast Florida. Before we really dive in, I wanted to give you a little background. I won't start at third grade like the Goonies, but I grew up in the upper Midwest, as a lot of Floridians did these days. But on the North Coast, you might call it, if you're not actually from a coastal state. So I was actually born in Minnesota, which is the furthest from the coast that you could possibly be in the lower 48, but somehow found my way to Louisiana for my PhD, studying salt marshes down there on the Gulf Coast, the Gulf of Mexico coast, and then went over to work actually as a federal scientist with the U.S. Geological Survey, again studying coastal wetlands in the San Francisco Bay and up in Northern California, Humboldt Bay by the Redwoods. And since 2022, which is somewhere between 3,000 years ago, started at University of North Florida as a coastal plant ecologist in our Department of Biology. So these coasts, the West Coast, the Gulf Coast, and the Atlantic Coast are a bit different. Their wetland communities are pretty different, but we'll focus in today just on Northeast Florida. So a little bit of introduction kind of on what my lab group does, what our research focuses on. Really, we try to have a collaborative approach and a watershed approach to coastal wetland plant ecology. So we call it WeEco because you have to have some snazzy, catchy name for your lab. I won't tell you what that means or if it's an acronym or not. I'll leave it to you to decide. It can mean different things to different folks. But my lab is basically a field ecology lab, which means we're actually not out in the field that much because it takes a lot of preparation beforehand and processing of samples and data afterwards. But we're out on the water a lot in these coastal wetlands. Sometimes those are good days in the field. Sometimes those are not as good days in the field. This is a text I got from one of my staff members a few years ago. And that boat is not sitting on water, which I don't know how much everyone knows about boats, but they actually like water to float. So we have some interesting times sometimes out there studying coastal wetlands, but it's often muddy, difficult, hard work, right? Sweating, full of mud, bitten by bugs, but with a great smile. So one of the things I love about coastal wetlands and coastal wetland ecology as a scientist, you don't have to do rocket surgery to do really good science. You just need to work hard and maybe enjoy suffering. So given that very brief kind of who am I, what do I do? I'd like to go over a little bit of the status of coastal wetlands, Northeast Florida, kind of what I mean when I say coastal wetlands. I know y'all are the choir that I'm preaching to here, but just to make sure we're all on the same page and to go over some of the things that make studying coastal wetlands really complicated and interesting, rewarding. So when I say coastal wetland in Northeast Florida, in that context, you probably think of something like this. So we have low marsh, cordgrass, right, Spartina, some juncus, which if you know, you will avoid at all costs getting close to. And then, right, a little bit of ghost forest, some old cabbage palm stumps, right? You can see flatwoods in the background. This, I think, is from Cradle Creek Preserve. So this is kind of a classic coastal wetland, a coastal salt marsh, and probably one of the visions that comes up when I say that term. But in Northeast Florida, we have lots of different types of coastal wetlands. We have salt marsh on the right, but we also are starting to have mangrove communities. I wouldn't call them forests just yet, maybe shrublands. Um, but we do have mangroves coming in, which I'll talk a little bit about later on. But the interesting thing, I think, about coastal wetlands, right? I'm a plant ecologist by training. I'm fascinated by plants and how they work. But to understand them in coastal wetlands, I actually have to study pretty much everything else about coastal wetlands. These systems are a tight, complicated interplay of water, soil, and plants, right? Just like any other ecosystem, but for coastal wetlands, those relationships are highly dynamic. And I'll give you some examples of that. So my lab measures those things, quantifies those things, does research on those components. So we measure water and water quality using sensors that we go out and take samples from or bring back to the lab and analyze, or we put equipment out to record continuously. We take soil cores to understand what the soil looks like over time as you go down. And we take lots of data on the plant communities. So which species are there, how abundant they are, and what other environmental factors might be influencing their distribution. So to understand tides and water levels in a coastal wetland, and I use that term pretty broadly, right? We're often dealing with tidal forcings that change, right? Twice a day, we have highs and lows in our region. And that makes it very difficult to do field work sometimes. We either can or cannot go out on a low or high tide, depending on what we want to measure that day, especially if we're on the boat. So even just getting out to these ecosystems can be kind of tricky. But this tidal action and how high in elevation we would call it, or how flooded the wetland is, really makes a big difference for its resilience, which is what we'll really be focusing on today. And I wanted to ask a trick question for what the tide range is in Jacksonville to kind of get that number in your head. What is our tide range? And it's a trick question because Jacksonville's really big, right? So it depends where you are. But the largest portion of our tides by Mayport, right, by the river emptying out into the Atlantic, up to around 1.5 meters, so just under 5 feet. So we have really high tide range in our region, the highest tide range in coastal Florida, and it gets even higher as you go north into Georgia. But of course, as you go upstream in the St. Johns or in other tributaries, that tide range shrinks to where it's not very big in Palatka, but still tidal somehow, which still blows my mind. All right, so we have water and tides coming in, making things complicated. We also have soils in coastal wetlands that are unique compared to other ecosystems in Northeast Florida. They're unique for two reasons, really. One is the soil actually builds over time. So they trap sediment that's in the water, and that drops out onto the marsh or the mangroves, and that can add up over time with slow sea level rise. But not only do they trap particles like sand and clay and silt, but that soil is really wet, right? We're talking about wetlands, which means there's not a lot of oxygen. In fact, there's almost none in these soils. oxygen is really good for decomposing things. When you don't have oxygen, decomposition is really slow. Think of like bog people that you hear in the news, right? You can find folks that have been in a peat bog in the Arctic or subarctic for thousands of years. It slows decomposition so that old roots and old stems can hang out and have a lot of organic matter just in the soil over time for thousands of years, really. So that soil environment is really unique to coastal wetlands. And for plants, right, my passion, what I get jazzed about, which influences the other two and vice versa. For salt marshes, right, in our region, really smooth cord grass, Spartina alterniflora, is the one you see, right? When you go over the bridge over Pablo Creek on Atlantic or Beach or JTB, the green or brown, kind of at this time of year, starting to green up, is mostly this one species, monoculture. Super productive. As you get upslope or a little bit less salty, you can get needle rush, Juncus rhamarianus. And again, this is the one that will leave the little dead tips in your skin all over the place, which is a real fun time. And we have several other species of salt marsh grasses and even flowers in these ecosystems. But we also have mangroves in Northeast Florida. Really, two are common as they can be here. One's black mangrove, so that's Avicennia germinans. They have these propagules, little teardrop shapes. I call them that. That's kind of a silly word. They're not seeds. Mangroves are really interesting in that from their flowers, which make delicious honey, as many of you probably know. When they're pollinated, they create a seed, but that seed is not what falls off the plant. The seed actually germinates into a baby plant right there on the mother tree. And then what the mother tree releases are these floating little baby plants that we call propagules. That's really neat because then they float around on the water, and as soon as they strand out somewhere, if it's a good place, they are ready to go. They put their roots down and they're already there. They don't have to germinate or come from a seed. It's just a little packed in baby plant ready to go. So for black mangroves, they look like these little teardrops, and you can find these on the beach, especially in the fall and winter. And you can grow them out into your own little mangrove. You can do the same with red mangroves, which are the classic mangroves with prop roots that you see, these kind of like half water, half air shots with a shark or fish swimming underneath. Those are almost always red mangroves. Their propagules are a bit different. They're these long pencils. And again, you can find these washed up on the beaches in our area, especially after a big storm in the summer or late summer. And you can just stick this in a little ball jar of water and sand, and it'll root out and grow. I have some at home right now. So black and red mangroves are pretty common in our area too. We'll get back to that. But coastal wetlands and salt marshes especially, they occur all over the planet, right? So the Southeast US has some of the most habitat of salt marshes for anywhere on the planet, which is really cool and unique. But they occur in all types of climate, which are these different colors. So even in the tropics, they occur in desert climates, super dry, arid climates, right? All over the world, we have salt marshes. And ours are a little bit different than others, right? But beyond occurring everywhere, they kind of occur in these settings, we could call it. So this is a kind of a lot for one slide, but for us in Northeast Florida, as you go south from Duval County into like the GTM, so the Guanatolamata Matanzas, down by St. Augustine, it's really a wave-dominated system. They're lagoons, right? Think of the Indian River Lagoon. They're really linear features. There's some wetland area. There's barrier islands, very few inlets. They're really dominated by waves. There's not a huge tidal force scene. There's not really big rivers. that dump into the coast. So that is to our south and all the way down to Miami. From here north, we really get back barrier systems and a lot more river input, right? You think of Sapelo Island and Tybee and all the barrier islands up in Georgia with rivers flowing in. The St. John's is kind of its own unique beastie at this transition, which makes this region really, really interesting for studying coastal wetlands because we're at a transition point for the whole region from these lagoons to more river-dominated systems, which is really, really interesting. And because of that transition, our region, especially north of St. Johns County, has most of the salt marsh on Florida's Atlantic coast. Right, so if you look here, this is salt marsh and mangrove habitat colored in blue from a chapter that's a few years old now. But these rivers and their estuaries have a lot of the coastal salt marsh area. But of course, development is changing these coasts. So here's what a wetland might look like in general in this little figure. As we develop and armor, especially harden our shorelines with rising sea levels, we could start to squeeze out these wetlands as they try to migrate or adjust to sea level. Development also comes with pollution and nutrients and lots of other things. But today, I'll mention a few specific challenges for coastal wetlands and their resilience. So how they can deal with stress over time. And when we lose resilience in a coastal wetland, then we can change the type of wetland we have. And that's really what I'll be talking about for the rest of the time. So there's these three big challenges that coastal wetlands in our region are facing. One is sea level rise, one is salinity intrusion, and one is tropicalization, which is kind of a ridiculous term for warming, essentially. If we start with sea level rise, historically, our sea level rise rate was around a foot per century, or 2.8 millimeters per year. So this is just sea level over time for the last about 100 years at Mayport, and there's the long-term rate, and this is NOAA data. So that is actually kind of our background rate. Coastal wetlands are comfortable with that rate of sea level rise. They can adjust, and actually that sea level rise is part of why they can build soil that's really deep because they can adjust over time, over hundreds and thousands of years. But if we get really high rates of sea level rise, wetlands can't keep up in place. They can't keep building at those high rates. So we end up losing those wetlands, or they have to migrate inland, either upslope or upstream, if they can, right? And they can't always. So from global studies, we think that rate where they can no longer keep up is probably 7 or 8 millimeters per year. That becomes important because since 2010, our rate has been probably closer to 10 millimeters per year, so a centimeter per year. So instead of a foot per century, that's more like 3 feet or a meter every century. And when we have rates like that, wetlands just can't keep pace. So they're going to have to move or drown. So this is a big stressor for resilience in these coastal systems. You can kind of see that in Pablo Creek, where this image is from. This is an old aerial from the 40s, which I could just spend the rest of the time clicking back and forth between this and modern, but I won't. If you look in the middle at that island, you can see it's pretty forested in the 40s and not so forested in the modern day. So those upland forests have been converted to wetlands, to coastal wetlands. So that's upslope or upland migration from sea level rise. And we can measure that and see how those new wetlands are performing, how resilient that forested island is to future sea level rise. And I showed you that image from Pablo Creek. So this is the watershed that UNF is in. It's also the watershed that lots of other places are in. But since I'm at UNF, that's my marker. And it goes to the Atlantic. So we have UNF to the left there. That creek goes down south across JTB and then east to what's now the Intracoastal, where JTB crosses before the ICW goes down into the Tolomato River, and then it turns north and drains to the St. John's. So I've circled a couple interesting spots here that I'll talk about some of our research, just little snippets or vignettes about what we're working on in case it's interesting. And the first one is right here between JTB, which is that middle bridge, and Beach Boulevard, which is to the north. And this is an approximate outline of about 1,000 acres of salt marsh that UNF owns. It was given by the Webb family as a research parcel. So it's boat access, lots of low salt marsh, and a couple islands. And this is fun. I wanted to bring it up because the land trust is actually our neighbor to the east. So the parcels just to the east, especially north of JTB, are owned by the North Florida Land Trust, which is fun. So happy to chat about, you know, being good neighbors, basically, or sharing our research findings. But what we're doing on some of these islands that are drowning, within our footprint at least, is starting to monitor these coastal wetlands. So we don't have a ton of monitoring data or historical data in our region. We have a lot from near St. Augustine because there's a estuarine research reserve supported by NOAA. And then we have a fair bit to the north from the Park Service, the Timucuan Preserve, and there's various other research stations up the coast. But in between, there's actually kind of a data gap on how our coastal wetlands are doing. So we've started setting up some of these monitoring pieces to understand the water, right, the soil, and the plant communities, how they look today, using imagery, how they may have looked in the past, and hopefully, and I say that stronger than I used to, hopefully we can continue to do this work, right, for decades, and in the future look back and understand the long-term trajectory of these systems. So this is work in partnership with the Water Management District, FWC, the Park Service. We're installing water quality monitors to know what the water is doing, right? How high it is, if it's salty or not. This middle picture is one of my undergraduates, Max, who since graduated, installing what's called an elevation table. It's a very interesting process where you essentially do construction out in the marsh. We have boardwalks, so it sounds more invasive than it is, but we hammer steel rods down into the ground till we can't anymore, to put it crudely. And then we have a little table. I'll go back and show you. That's this middle thing that we drop pins onto the surface. If we do that over years and years, we can actually measure how much the wetland is going up over time or accreting. If we compare that to sea level rise, we can understand, is that wetland keeping pace or is it starting to fall behind? So really important data. We also take soil cores and quadrats and do lots of other things. But this salt marsh, adjacent to y'all's property, is a key focal point in our region's understanding of sea level rise and what that means for our coastal uplands, but also our coastal wetlands, especially salt marshes. So saltwater intrusion is another big impact on our coastal wetlands. And for this, we have to go upstream a little bit. So we think about salt marshes mostly when we say coastal wetlands, but coastal wetlands and tidal wetlands can also be low in salinity. So they can be brackish or they can be almost fresh. right? We can actually have tidal freshwater. Those are usually forests. So cypress, right? That can be tidal, and that is really a coastal wetland still. But as saltwater comes up further and further upstream, we think about it in the St. Johns River, but also in all of these tributaries. This again is an example from Poplar Creek, just south of JTB. If you have just a little bit of salt, so less than 10% of seawater strength, so we would say 2 or 3 parts per thousand is the unit we use. Seawater is 35 parts per thousand. If you go from fresh, which is 0, to 2 to 3, you lose those tidal freshwater, those cypress trees. They can't handle that amount of salinity. So you transition from a forest to a marsh. And in these two images, you see that in Pablo Creek. So on the left, this is an image from the 90s, which is not that long ago, right? That's in my lifetime, which has not been very long. And I've outlined where the marsh was on this tributary in the 90s. And the rest of it you can see is forest. That'd be cypress trees, tidal freshwater. If we look today, less than 30 years later, that same outline does not cover the marsh, right? Those trees have died back further upstream, and we now have marsh replacing that forested wetland community. So this is a big change in which plants are dominant and all of the processes happening in our coastal wetlands. One place that's really interesting and newly available for study coming up is the Pablo Creek Conservation Area. This is owned by the St. Johns River Water Management District recently. This is Pablo Creek going from west to east. To orient us, at the top is JTB. In the center is Hodges. To the left is Kernan, right, and the university. And then San Pablo to the east. This is a really big parcel of land that is now conserved from development. It's very exciting. It's exciting also because it's the transition here between salty marsh and fresh tidal forest. So I was just there actually yesterday for the first time. It is a beautiful site. It is like this treasure trove of unanswered questions that we're really excited to understand and apply to other tributaries in the region. We can see some cypress trees kind of hanging on for dear life here, and then marsh underneath. This is a low salinity marsh, but that is an impact of saltwater intrusion. All right, and then the last kind of threat or state change to resilience I want to talk about is tropicalization, which is the official word, but it's just a lack of freezing temps. As the climate warms, we have fewer and fewer freezing days, and those freezing days are less and less severe. Right? So in our region, the last really severe mangrove killer freeze was really in the 80s, the mid 80s and then 1989. It's been a long time. So mangroves without freezing events can disperse into our salt marshes and start growing. And it's not an instant conversion. And there's a whole discussion we could have on whether that's good, bad, or just different, right? It depends on what you're asking. But this is something that is actively changing our coastal wetlands right now, and will continue to do so into the future. So some of the work that my lab is participating in with the Park Service, Smithsonian, and other folks is just understanding where the mangroves are, right, and where they might go. So we've been working with Ches Vervecchi at the Park Service, Candy Feller with Smithsonian, and other awesome partners, including Georgia DNR recently, to really actually get out in the field and understand where these mangroves are distributed, how many of them they are. And we found them all the way up into Georgia and Cumberland Sound. So on Cumberland Island and then across the way. It's the first time that we think there's documented mangroves in the state of Georgia. That manuscript just came out last month, but they're going to keep moving north with fewer and fewer freezes. So one of the things that we're doing is exploring, again, within Pablo Creek even, are there mangroves in our watershed? And if there are, how many and where? Where are they? One site that I'll mention is just north of Atlantic Boulevard in Pablo Creek. This is owned by the city of Atlantic Beach with an easement with y'all, with NFLT. I'm actually working right now on finalizing hold harmless to do some long-term research there. But just in Pablo Creek, there's more than 100, and from the St. John's and up, there's almost 1,000 mangroves, and we know there's more that we have yet to sample. So there's a lot more mangroves in our area than previously thought. Just a few years ago, we would have thought there weren't any, unless you were fishing and, following the habitat change. But all of these dots are a mangrove. You can see many of them are red, so that's just the species. But this one island in Pablo Creek has like 75 mangroves on it, which is really wild. So it's an interesting place to study this conversion or change between salt marsh and mangroves as these mangroves get larger and start reproducing and spreading. So I wanted to make sure I kept to right about 35 minutes. So to wrap up, I just wanted to have 3 points, maybe, influence discussion or to think about. Okay, I've just talked a little bit about coastal wetlands in our region, some of the research that my lab and our partners are doing, but how does that matter beyond, right, the understanding? So, right, we'll publish papers that 5 people will read, and we'll talk with, stakeholders and try to influence management. But what actions are actually supported by work like this, right, by monitoring and research in coastal wetlands? One, I think important one, is to identify resilient habitat. Habitat that's resilient and healthy now, so we can preserve it, and habitat that, given sea level rise and saltwater intrusion, may be resilient in the future. So looking ahead to where marshes are going to maybe have to migrate. And I'm super thrilled to be talking with y'all because you're really leading the way on that, right? This group knows a lot about preservation, conservation, whatever term you'd like to use, from your involvement in SASME, right? The South Atlantic Salt Marsh Initiative, making sure that we're protecting places where migration can happen, uh, and looking into, coastal squeeze and where that might actually prevent migration, right? Conserving land that's great now and into the future. So thank you all for all of the good work you're doing on that, right? On the research side, right, we can understand maybe the pace of change and what environmental factors lead to salt marsh to help with those predictive mapping efforts in the future. Another important one for habitat that's not so resilient today, or maybe has been degraded by human activities, research and monitoring can really help inform effective restoration of that habitat. So how best to undertake restoration, and then through monitoring and adaptive management, if it's working well, right? And what we can do differently to make sure that our targets for restoration are being met. I'll give you one example of that from Pablo Creek again. So part of UNF's salt marsh property at the very south end is diked. So there was a spoil island deposit area, and it was used up to maybe 2010 or so in talking with Ron Brockmeyer. So this image is from Ron Brockmeyer of the Water Management District. But we have these dikes around. Some of them have degraded, you can see, but we're in conversation now to restore that parcel and actually gain back the benefits of coastal wetland without, right, the weird hydrology that you get when you have a dike and water kind of stuck in this really big sandy hill, right? That often doesn't occur in these salt marshes. So some of our work is to actually understand how to design a restoration that's successful for the functions we're interested in, but then monitoring that over time to understand that we're meeting our targets for function. Which kind of leads me to the last piece. Coastal wetland research is important to inform management that can increase resilience. And not just resilience, but resilience of specific functions that we enjoy, that we would call ecosystem services. So again, this group knows this better than most. There's a lot of services and benefits of wetlands, especially coastal wetlands. People enjoy going out and recreating in them, right? Catching fish, catching crabs, shrimp. Lots of our commercial fisheries spend some part of their life cycle in coastal wetlands, almost all of them. It's habitat for birds, and bird watchers enjoy visiting these habitats, right? It cleans our water, traps sediment, takes up nutrients, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, right? One of the things that my lab is pursuing right now that I'll kind of end on is coastal wetlands as a climate solution. So these coastal habitats, because they suck carbon dioxide out of the air, doing photosynthesis, as all plants do, uniquely in coastal wetlands, right, we talked about that lack of decomposition. So that CO2 that they take out of the air, they store in the soil, and they can do that for thousands of years, right? So if you have a management action like restoration that increases that rate, you're actually helping to mitigate climate change, which is something that can be a really valuable addition as we seek to reduce fossil fuel emissions. And coastal wetlands are actually the best ecosystem for doing that. Better than rainforests, better than any other ecosystem. Per area, they take and store carbon at rates higher than anywhere else. So one piece of research that a lot of folks are pursuing right now is understanding how to maximize that climate benefit for these wetlands. But with that, I have reached time, so I want to make sure I left plenty of space for questions, but thanks for listening. I put my contact info there if you want to reach out or have any follow-ups, but I will stop sharing and we can chat.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Dr. Jones, for sharing that with us. And I don't mean to put her on the spot, but I know our SASME ref is on this call. So that's pretty neat that we all got to hear what you guys are working on. If you have any questions, folks, feel free to drop them in the chat. You can also use the raise hand feature if you would like to talk, and I can unmute you. We'll give everybody a few minutes to get questions typed out. Anybody? Anybody?
Well, if there aren't questions, I'm curious to hear from y'all what your favorite coastal wetland is. If you don't have a favorite, you should have a favorite.
That's a great question. Favorite coastal wetland? You know what I can do is there we go. I've just made it so you can unmute yourself. So if you want to ask a question live, feel free to do that. And it does look like we got some questions coming through. Brenda, if you want to field those.
Sure. So the first question is, how is wildlife use of coastal wetlands changing the plant life?
That's a great question. So, as a plant ecologist, I don't directly study much of the wildlife, but I work with a lot of colleagues who do, and it really depends on the wildlife. So, as salt marshes drown and become mudflats, that's not great for rails or sparrows on the bird side, of course, or a lot of the snails or other components of the system. But mudflats are really good habitat for other critters, right? So sometimes oysters can come in there once things are subtidal. Transitioning from marsh to mangrove, we still have a lot of open questions, but we know that fish species are migrating up further than they used to. Whether that's because of temperature or the plant life is still kind of an open question, but the wildlife use definitely changes as the plant community shifts. Hopefully, if there's enough conservation at a large enough scale, there's enough different patches on the landscape so that even though there's change, we can still kind of support the same wildlife communities.
Thank you. Next question. Given the state of politics, are you seeing any pressure on federal or state funding for your research?
That is quite the question. I have the same question. It's largely uncertain right now. It seems like nobody really knows what's going to happen on the funding side. A lot of our funding for coastal wetland stuff is NOAA, so a lot of uncertainty and hesitation about that funding continuing. A lot of coastal resilience work is climate change, sea level rise focused. There's some concern that support for that will be less. Um, right now, we don't know. Um, I will say for NOAA, I have a grant under review right now, and I expect that program to completely disappear this year and not be funded at all. Um, but right, we collaborate with federal scientists a lot on our research, whether that's the Park Service, especially here, or the USGS and others. And I think the decimation of the federal service is really hampering research across the board. So it's it is a more difficult situation on the funding side and the collaborative side than I've seen, at least.
Next question. Other than supporting NFLT, how can people help save, improve the wetlands?
Yeah, I mean, keeping with the political theme, I guess, which as a state university employee, maybe I shouldn't. Um, Pushing for legislation and for policies that you think will advance wetland health. So development codes at the local level or right at the state or federal level, um, nutrient regulation, right, restoration dollars, really pushing policies at the large scale is what we need to prevent these wetlands from continuing to have the chronic stress. Um, that's the large scale, but right, plugging into other local organizations is a great way to get involved locally. So like the Riverkeeper, the St. John's or St. Mary Riverkeeper, depending on where you're at, um, supporting other environmental organizations that are passionate about wetlands and coastal wetlands, I think is a good first step to getting involved, or 15th step for y'all.
Thank you. Next question. From your research, what are the top root causes for saltwater intrusion into our rivers and tributaries?
Mm. It kind of depends on the tributary, but kind of the ultimate cause for a lot of saltwater intrusion is sea level rise. So as the ocean side is higher, it's pushing further in. So sea level rise is a big driver of saltwater intrusion. If you have changes in freshwater flow, so if we go through a drought, for example, that can cause salinity to go upstream further on kind of an annual scale. It's kind of unclear right now if precipitation patterns are going to change in the future with climate change. That's really hard to predict compared to temperature. But other factors of climate change could have an impact. And of course, human action definitely influences saltwater intrusion. Um, I won't speak specifically to dredging, but we have drastically altered the depth and configuration of the St. John's, and that absolutely can have impacts on saltwater intrusion as well.
Great. Next question. What is the effect of wave action from ships and boats on salt marsh?
Yeah, that's a great question. So if you remember the 40s imagery I shared compared to today, the ICW there, you could actually see that it was fairly newly expanded. You could see the old kind of winding path of the tidal creek. We have a lot of erosion that's happening to our salt marshes that is not specifically or directly attributable to sea level rise. That kind of leads to drowning, especially up in the channels where there's not a lot of boat traffic, but you see channels kind of widening and ponding happening. That's kind of classic sea level rise. But at the edge, especially on the ICW, that erosion rate can be really, really high, meters per year in some places. And that's, we think, largely wave action. So erosion is definitely a big problem along these high traffic channels.
Great, thank you. We just got a comment. My favorite marsh area is the Nassau River area due to spending COVID at my mom's. We spent lots of hours exploring in the boat and getting lost in the marshes out there.
Oh, that's great.
And the next, my favorite salt marshes are in and around the Talbots and Nassau Sound. Next comment, I think y'all have equipment set up at the next door neighbor's Marvin Nippers.
Maybe. I don't know Marvin, but we may, or someone we work with may, depending on where that is.
And last comment is no question, but this was a fantastic and super informative presentation.
Thank you all. I appreciate that.
Yes, absolutely. Well, thank you again, Dr. Jones, for joining us today. Thank you guys for being here. Again, as a reminder, we will post this recorded session on the NFLT YouTube channel, which I will drop in the chat once more if I can talk and do that at the same time. Looks like not. Okay, I will drop that in there in just a minute. And I also wanted to remind everybody that we are doing a membership drive right now. Our goal is to get 100 new members by Tuesday, which is Earth Day. So if you have a friend that wants to join in the future, you can share this link, which I do have, with them. We would love for for more folks to join and to reach our goal of 100 new members by Tuesday. And we're over halfway there. So that's exciting. And again, just a reminder that next month we'll be back with Jody Willis from the Florida Native Plant Society, the local chapter, ICSIA. So we'll be back then. And we are celebrating Earth Day at Smith Lake Preserve. If you don't already have plans, I hope you'll join us there in Keystone Heights. We're going to reveal our new interpretive panels along the Florida Trail. And then that evening, we're going to keep the party going at Episcopal School of Jacksonville. Their photography students came out to Bogey Creek Preserve and took some fantastic photographs. They're going to showcase those for us. We'll also have a 2026 fall calendar that you can pre-order. So lots of fun things going on to celebrate Earth Day next week. So last thank you to everyone. Thank you, Dr. Jones. Thank you guys for joining us, and have a wonderful Wednesday.
Thanks, y'all.